Hello all and welcome to English class. The last month has been a little bit difficult, being stuck in quarantine with two small children, so let's get going. Mohsin Hamid is a celebrated Pakistani-British novelist whose recent novels, especially The Reluctant Fundamentalist, have made him widely read and wildly successful. His life has been spent spread across Pakistan, which is itself an acronym, by the way, the US and the UK, in all of which he's lived, studied, and worked. The Reluctant Fundamentalist, by the way, was adapted into a blockbuster film that earned only $2 million on its $15 million budget, despite a cast including 3 A-list American movie stars. It's like we don't like films humanizing brown people. Anyway, Exit West is a migration story in which Gia Tolentino writes, quote, "The refugee's journey is compressed into an instant by use of a magical realist device, doors, that serve as terrestrial wormholes to other points on the globe. Magical realism, by the way, is a genre of writing in which everything is normal except for some things that aren't, and those things fundamentally alter the normality of everything else, ideally causing us to question the bases for our assumptions of normality and whether the normal that we're accustomed to is good and enduring or just temporarily the way that things are. This is what this is what future human societies will undoubtedly call the Gamblian paradox. They don't think it be like... Always screw that up. This is like my third take trying to get that right. Moving on! Anyway, much of human history has been spent on the attempt to control space-time. Humans seek to control physical space, policing its borders and kicking out those who don't belong, and they seek control of abstract space. Policing, by the way, the word, the maintenance of control and order, is etymologically descended from polis, the organization of people into a coherent, categorizable group. Policing one's nation then means more than putting up a wall. It means controlling the imagination of a nation, is something that Benedict Anderson would say. And so, controlling the people who comprise the nation. Yes, I just used the word comprise correctly. That's a flex. Moving on. Palestinian-American philosopher Edward Saeed described refugees as, quote, a creation of the 20th century state, end quote, rather than a natural human phenomenon, while German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who is awesome, but who also slept with German philosopher and noted Nazi Martin Heidegger, suggests that human rights and citizens' rights are really and dangerously one and the same, so that in the absence of a government willing to assure human rights to a given person, that person might not actually be a person, which seems problematic. Think Tom Hanks in the film The Terminal, but with more genocide. That said, Italian philosopher, that's the fourth one we've mentioned in this same paragraph, writes that the existence of refugees, though unfortunate, quote, calls into question the principles of the nation-state, quote, end quote, that rendered them refugees, and thereby, quote, helps clear the field for a no longer delayable renewal of categories, end quote, wherein the subject's nationality doesn't necessarily arbitrate a subject's humanity. That sounds nice. In the world of Exit West, immigration departments, border patrols, and coast guards are rendered immediately obsolete. Why storm the fence in Melilla, dig a fence beneath the U.S. border, or risk crossing the Mediterranean on a dingy raft when passing through a magical door can take you from circumstances dominated by conflict, disenfranchisement, and underdevelopment to a place of stability and prosperity? And in a world in which things and people can move around so quickly, how does a nation control its own self-definition? Exit West makes some suggestions, though they're not all good for the comfortable and the comfortably rich. Saeed and Nadia are clearly the focus of the novel, though Tolentino shrewdly differentiates this from them being the center of the novel. They're the only named characters, and it's interesting that this novel charts the course of their romance as much as it does their journey through the world. As they get progressively further away from their unnamed home country, their relationship grows more distant as well. Literary critic Michael Prefect notes that their migration away from one another is actually just another form of migration occurring in the novel. Though they both have unique character traits that prevent easy stereotyping, Nadia, for one, is a firebrand who bucks tradition, yet nonetheless eagerly takes up the role of pseudo-daughter-in-law to Saeed's widowed father, whereas Saeed is timid but an increasingly radical member of his faith who nonetheless uses drugs. What can't be denied is the entanglement of their lives from the very beginning with global flows and hyper-modernity. They're probably in a Middle Eastern country. Hamid admits that he was thinking of Lahore, Pakistan when he wrote the book, but kept things general because he didn't want to imagine the fall of his hometown. Keeping it general, by the way, makes it feel like it applies to anywhere. The casual reader will be tempted, though, to think of the unnamed country as Syria, whose civil war and unrest would fit neatly with the book's publication. Saeed's family lives in a high-rise apartment. He works in advertising, the culmination of consumer culture. They order drugs over the internet and watch satellites streaking through the sky and talk excessively on their smartphones of travel. Regarding travel, by the way, human geographer, and I don't know exactly what that means, Tim Cresswell notes that, quote, the foundational narratives of modernity have been constructed around the brute fact of moving. Mobility as liberty, modernity as progress, end quote, he writes. Nadia and Saeed's first date, meanwhile, is at a Chinese restaurant, and they meet in an evening class on corporate identity and product branding, which sounds the absolute worst. I prefer teaching English. My favorite touch is that Nadia has a lemon tree on her balcony. It comes up with some frequency throughout the novel. Indeed, it might even serve as a barometer to their relationship or their relationship to modernity. Suffice it to say, though, that a lemon tree is a modern and global hybrid. Lemons don't exist in the wild. To make a lemon tree, one has to crossbreed citron, pomelo, and mandarin, all of which only occur in South and East Asia and Australia over the course of centuries. Then transport that to the Mediterranean, where it comes to signify wealth in ancient Rome, and from ancient Rome disperse various cultivars back across the Old World, where Christopher Columbus picks it up and brings it to the New World on his first or second voyage, interestingly enough. We're not sure which one. We are sure it didn't go well for the New World, though. It's enjoyable to root for Nadia in this novel as she grows more free over the course of it, shedding first the robe she wears to perform religious conservatism. She wears them only, as she says, quote, so men don't fuck with me, end quote, the best line in the book, then shedding more and more trappings of traditionalism, including, quote, mental patriarchy. That's not actually in the book. I put that in quotes because it's Bob Marley's, well, no, that's my thing. Moving on, including mental patriarchy in the same vein as Jamaican philosopher Bob Marley's concept of mental slavery. That's where I was trying to go with it. And with it, the expectation of heterosexuality. She's a spicy meatball. Though she was a kick-ass independent woman at home, her migration permits even more audacious forays and mental migrations away from her originally charted ways of being, or ontologies if we want to get all philosophical, and we do. Nadia grows more uncomfortable in inherently uncomfortable, unstable circumstances. Philosopher and literary critic Judith Butler's concept of structuring structures begins breaking down in this post-Magic Door world, enabling her to cross gendered, sexual, and racial boundaries as easily as physical ones. She has a real nice moment with a girl in Greece. She joins a council in London composed mostly of Nigerians who, she notes, wouldn't necessarily call themselves Nigerians because, quote, there was perhaps no such thing as a Nigerian, end quote, and she eventually settles down with another nice girl she meets in California. She doesn't spend much time looking back, bringing to mind famous Indian author Salman Rushdie's claim that, quote, the past is a country from which we have all immigrated, end quote, which dovetails neatly with Hamid's line that, quote, when we migrate, we murder from our lives those we leave behind. As Nadia flourishes, though, Saeed withers, perhaps seen best in London, where Nadia is comfortable and trusting of her housemates and similarly trusted by them. She's a bona fide member of the council, to which Saeed isn't even invited. Amanda Lodgy writes that Saeed's association with nationalist frameworks is reinforced by his nostalgia for familiar institutions, so he begins visiting a house of people who came from their home country, who rather quickly radicalize him, kind of. Emasculated by Nadia's growing power and finesse in an unstructured world, by people in their London house, and by Nadia's refusal to move to the other place, the other house that is, which should have seemed like a stupid proposal to begin with, like who would live on a different floor than your girlfriend, Saeed gets a gun, a prosthetic phallus, if you will. He doesn't use it, of course. Still recording, okay. Doesn't use it, of course. Anyway, despite finding comfort in the house of people who look and sound like him, he seems to understand that the world is changing quickly. Even the residents there seem to suggest that religious principles should be the chief organizing factor for humans. Quote, for what did those other divisions matter now in a world full of doors? The other divisions that mattered now, the only divisions that mattered now, were between those who sought the right of passage and those who would deny them passage, end quote. For indeed, division on the basis of religion has typically been both efficient and peaceful. Even Saeed seems to see the danger and the sort of meaninglessness here. That said, even language doesn't seem to be a good way of dividing people up, as the narrator discusses Nadia's experience at the council in a rather iconoclastic way, writing, together in this group they conversed in a language that was built in part from English. Also, they spoke different variations of English, different Englishes, and so when Nadia gave voice to an idea or opinion among them, She did not need to fear that her views could not be comprehended, for her English was like theirs, one among many. This breaks down the idea of language as being a point of incomprehension, as separating and stratifying peoples. In the United States, Standard English, like received pronunciation in the United Kingdom, is the language of privilege, class, and whiteness. Banning or otherwise making informal language inappropriate in certain settings can therefore be a direct attack on a person's ability to belong in that setting, otherwise one codified by racial, gendered, and economic belonging. Though English still serves as a master language in this paragraph, an inheritance from either former colonization or current neo-imperialism in the form of business dealings and resource extractions, we see English serve a counter-hegemonic function here. Instead of separating, it unites. Pluralizing Englishes also speaks to democratizing and pluralizing other previously monolithic conceptions, like, say, English. You know, this whole time I've been waiting to talk about the Heart of Darkness scene at the very beginning of the novel, and I'm just gonna toss it in here because I think I'm running out of time. I already mentioned Freud in terms of Saeed's gun dick from London, so let's just keep that Freudian thing rolling. Cue up the first vignette, which I will not read because I have run out of time. The blackest black guy, whoever black, comes through a portal into a white woman's bedroom in Australia. Okay. It tells us most everything we need to know about the novel's premise. Psychoanalytic literary criticism through Freud suggests that interior spaces are feminine spaces, symbolic of the womb. The one happens to be in a white part of the world, Australia, and have a super white woman wrapped in white sheets who is alone and asleep. We also see intensely personal details around her, so not only is the woman physically vulnerable, but socially vulnerable as well. The narrator shares with us the presence of unused birth control pills and handcuffs, furry ones almost certainly, along with checkbooks and keys, objects and details we wouldn't normally share with people. Into this mess comes this person of color, this blackest black guy that ever blacked. Nadia later describes the process of moving through one of these doors as, quote, both like dying and like being born, so it's fun to imagine this scene as presenting a sort of reverse birth of formerly colonized peoples into the spaces that exploited their countries and countrymen over the last 4 centuries. Going off of historian Walter Rodney's famous text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which claims that European progress proceeded in direct relation to the amount of capital extracted from Africans, the global North screwed the global South for so long that they had a baby. And here it is. Walter Rodney, by the way, was assassinated shortly after publishing that book. They don't normally kill you for making things up. Anyway, the passage has clear connections to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, even mimicking Conrad's distinct, uncertain writing style beyond mentioning Heart of Darkness explicitly. Unlike Heart of Darkness, though, this man is fully developed as a thinking character, and a harmless one at that. Hyper-aware of the danger that comes from being unassociated with a group or a state which can protect you, and clearly feeling some human sympathy for the woman, he slips away into the night, a normal, scared human who didn't take a thing from the allegorical and helpless figure of Australia. There's more to say, but I don't really have time to say it. I'll leave off with a brief note about global flows and attempts at the circumscription that attend them. Unsurprisingly, the flow of people and things is generally one way. We see a strong current pulling people from unstable, less prosperous areas to more stable, more prosperous areas. But this current isn't singular. Rather, quote, the whole planet was on the move. Much of the global south headed to the global north, but also southerners moving to other southern places and northerners moving to other northern places. People who live in all places, but especially the richer northern ones, are labeled as natives, an important term in humanities and in Heart of Darkness, with the travelers uncomfortable, but certainly possessing agency in some ways through their mobility. Indeed, if the people are actually detained in one country, they can just wait for a portal to open up and then get out. It's not really shocking then that the United States, particularly the western United States, serves as a point where Saeed and Nadia feel most at ease. Hamid writes the area's natives were removed long ago, and any claim to nativeness is always a little fraught, meaning that the person or his grandparents were born there. California represents the collision of a lot of different peoples from east, west, south, and north, with not so many actual natives there to displace and when people arrive. Things aren't exactly great, but the novel does paint a more optimistic future for uncontrollable human migration that might inevitably follow this virus or the climate wars it spawns, upon which we will all shortly embark. That's all for today. Wash your hands.